Welcome back to the program. Well, as we mentioned earlier, Foreign Minister Penny Wong has told the UK that it must confront its colonial past, in order to move forward and modernize its relationship with Indo-Pacific nations. The Foreign Minister shared her own family's history working as domestic servants for British colonists. And joining me now to discuss this and a lot more, and I mean a lot more, is former Australian Strategic Policy Institute Executive Director Peter Jennings. Peter Jennings, thanks so much for joining me on the program here tonight. And I'm just absolutely fascinated by this speech that Penny Wong gave in the UK. And I have to wonder, is the best way to strengthen Australia's Pacific ties, but also our ties with the UK, which is a very crucial relationship, by, in a sense, trashing their history and a bit of ours as well?
So, James, my favourite line from the speech is where Penny Wong says, Britain, like Australia, is an island. And I hope the audience was impressed by that piece of analysis. There's a lot of boilerplate in this, James. It starts with a sort of a potted history. First there's white settlement, then there's the First World War under Britain's thumb, then there's the Second World War. We get out from under Britain's thumb, no thanks to anything Australia did. Then there's Gough Whitlam, then there's Paul Keating, then there's the modern age, and that's the last 250 years. I felt it rather underdid the work that Britain has done in post-colonial history to come to terms with the reality of the world after the Second World War. And frankly, the British have been investing very heavily in building an Indo-Pacific strategy, not least by sending their new aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, through the region in late 2021. I think a British response to Penny Wong's speech might be to say, where's Australia's strategy for Europe? Because we don't have that. And in other respects, I thought the speech was, frankly, the sort of thing you'd see produced by DFAT, except for a Labor government, you put in Whitlam and Keating, and for a coalition government, you mention Menzies and Howard. Otherwise, it's kind of the same speech. So that was my reaction to it.
And I mean, is there, I have heard from people that basically DFAT, all the mandarins there, and as well as the Labour Party, they both have kind of this idea that Britain is this sort of fusty, old, colonial sort of, leather armchairs and clubhouses sort of thing, and not really up to date with the modern world, and that they're having trouble, that they've been having trouble since Labour took over the reins in Canberra, in figuring out how we even stand. Is that correct?
Look, I think, all Australian governments, and certainly this government, doesn't seem to be putting as much priority as I would like to see, for example, on our relations outside of the Asian area. There is a bit of a sense that it's been Asia only for DFAT really since the recognition of China in the early 1970s. If anything, James, the lesson we've learnt from the last few years is we need to diversify. We need stronger relations in Europe. We need to be investing with Africa. We could even be thinking about the Middle East and Latin America if we want to be outrageous. And that's because Australia has global interests. And I think, never before have we seen globalisation sort of tie us more into the consequences of what happens in other parts of the world. So to, go to London and basically to say to the Brits, all your thinking is out of date, I don't think that does enough justice to how Britain is trying to think through its own post-Brexit world. And as we are about to, in just a few weeks, apparently sign up to a really big agreement with the UK and the United States on AUKUS for nuclear submarines, maybe there's a bit of British technological know-how that we're actually interested in.
Indeed. And I mean, and you mentioned, that the fact that while we are, Australia here, an island, as Penny Wong says, possibly channeling Kamala Harris with that level of analysis. I want to ask you about Ukraine, because of course that's someplace that we have a great interest in, despite being on the other side of the world. The US is set to send over dozens of Abrams tanks. Germany has changed its stance on the deployment of Leopard 2s from Poland. We saw our government and the French committing to more help on the front lines this week. But from a military perspective, Peter, What's your view on this? Because we've been speaking about this with a lot of people, with a lot of different views on this all week. Now, do you think we're doing enough? And do you think the West should be doing more in Ukraine?
James, we're not doing anywhere near enough. So at the moment, the most number of tanks that I can add up from the various countries offering them to Ukraine is about 100. Ukraine could easily use 1,000. And if you look at the numbers of tanks which the Russians have, even after all of those that have been destroyed in the last 12 months, they number in the thousands as well. So I'm pleased that the decision's been taken to provide tanks, but we really could be doing so much more. And I've just written a piece that should be in the Australian tomorrow, James, which argues that in Australia's case, as we operate the Abrams tank, which is what the Americans are providing Ukraine, I think we should be opening up our entire armoured training establishment for Ukraine service people to be brought here to train with our equipment. And let's do that in the thousands, because what needs to happen here is we move away from tokenism. Tokenism is not going to defeat totalitarianism. We have to give Ukraine the wherewithal that it needs in the next few months to make a decisive difference on the battleground. And if that happens, it puts Kiev into a position where it can start to negotiate with Russia from some strength. And, drip feeding small supplies of military equipment is just not going to do that. That will sustain a stalemate where people will continue to be killed in large numbers. So my view is, after a year almost of the fight, the democracies should be doubling down with more support, including combat aircraft. And if we do that, that might shift the dial in terms of a successful outcome for Ukraine in the first half of this year.
That's a fascinating analysis. I look forward to reading that tomorrow. But I want to move on from the terrestrial to the aquatic, because there are fresh concerns over the delivery timeline of our nuclear-powered subs under AUKUS. The first alarm bell, of course, went off after the U.S. Navy suspended submarine repair work at 4 of its West Coast docks to prevent the impact of future earthquakes. Okay, and then yesterday, Defense Minister Richard Marles confirmed Australia will not purchase conventionally powered subs from the French as a stopgap measure. Peter, Australia needs submarines for as long as they remain a relevant capability. So what's the solution here? Do we have a capability gap in all of this?
Well, that is the risk, James. We have the existing Collins-class submarines, which are frankly getting old. They are going to be upgraded. But at this stage, no one can have certainty about the time gap that might exist between the last of those Collins submarines retiring and the first of the nuclear-propelled submarines arriving sometime in the later 2030s. And frankly, it does worry me that Richard Marles doesn't want to have a plan B, which is to say a plan to maybe build or buy conventional submarines to fill that gap. What we're seeing here is a sort of a return to a fairly normal way of defence doing business, which is that you have one best shot. There's one project which you're going to deliver, and that's going to be successful. That's what we had with the French submarine until that got killed by Scott Morrison. Now with AUKUS, we're going to have the one best shot strategy, which is the nuclear submarines, which we may or may not see in 15 years' time or more, and nothing in between. It's almost like having a plan B is going to do damage to the first plan. That's a risk to me. And I would really be encouraging Richard Marles to think about, let's spend some money getting ourselves prepared to understand what we might have to do if the gap between our old submarines retiring and the new ones arriving is actually longer than we might think it will be.
Finally, Peter, before I let you go, I just need to ask you about this. Finally, the Australian government has said that individuals who are involved with human rights breaches in Iran and Myanmar will be subject to all sorts of sanctions and travel bans. Now, I say this is about time, but should we be doing, and in fact, actually the West be doing more, particularly for, say, the people in Iran who have been under that hideous totalitarian regime since I think 1979?
79. Yeah, we should have done more and earlier, but I'm glad the government is doing what's been announced. And James, just quickly to say, the government is in a position to do this because of legislation that was promoted by the late Senator Kimberley Kitching. She's responsible for Australia having Magnitsky-style laws, which makes it possible to sanction individuals now in Iran and Burma. And so all credit to her for thinking ahead and giving our government the capacity to do that sort of thing.
Well, that's a great reminder of the legacy of Kimberley Kitching, who is still much missed